In this series, we've been looking at how God's providence provides his promise. Providence is God's activity throughout history in providing for the needs of human beings, especially those who follow him in faith. The reason why we enjoy the book of Esther so much is because there's an unnamed character, the main character. The main character is God, though you do not find his name in the book. And sometimes our lives seem to be that way. You might say, where is God in this situation? What's going on? I feel like I've been abandoned. And that's the way we read through the book of Esther, because we don't see God directly working, but we see his fingerprints and evidences of his providences throughout the book. So to bring you up to speed as to where we are at now, it's been a little while. So remember, we have the villain. Remember who the villain is? The villain is Haman. Okay, he's the villain. And Haman, he has planned the annihilation of the Jewish race, and having a special hatred for one particular Jew. Who is that? Mordecai. That's Mordecai. Mordecai informs Esther of Haman's plan to annihilate the Jewish people, and suggests even that God may have provided her position as queen to save his people. Now, why would that be important to us today? Because of the cross, right? Through the lineage of the Jewish people. And so Esther plans on approaching the king knowing what we learn in chapter 4, verse 11. If you look at chapter 4, verse 11 with me, it says this: "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." You see, the king has not desired to see Esther lately. And so it's very probable that if she approaches the king, it very well may cost her her life. And that's the way we ended the last sermon in the book of Esther. This morning we're going to cover a lot of ground. And so I'm going to ease into the text. We're going to read the text thoroughly. I want you to be thinking about what's happening, because I'm not going to go verse by verse, word by word, to explain it all to you. Rather to read it story-like, like the Jewish people would during the Feast of Purim. So, we want to know, stepping in to chapter 5, will Esther survive? That's what we want to know. Will she be extended the scepter, or will she be murdered, slaughtered right there? So Esther chapter 5, verse 1. We'll read verses 1 through 8. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may go do what Esther has asked." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." I'm going to pause here instead of going on in the chapter. That's how we're going to walk through the text. Going to read a little bit, make some observations, read some more of the text, make some observations, and then when we get to the end, point out the main point, what I see in these chapters here. The first things we wanted to know was what? If Esther would survive approaching the king without having been summoned for longer than 30 days. And so we know now that Esther has survived. It says, in fact, that he was pleased with her, or if you have a different translation, it's going to say that she obtained favor in his sight. That word is a very particular word. When you see the word favor throughout the book, it's a clue of an indicator that God's providence is at work. That's the things we want to see in life, right? We want to see God working, and here we see it working throughout the book in the word favor. The second thing we as readers want to know is if the king is going to save the Jewish people. But Esther never asks. If you're reading through this, you're reading through the chapter, it's like she had 2 chances. What is going on? Well, is she scared? Think she's scared? I don't think so. The reason why I don't think she's scared is because she actually invites the villain to her banquet. So I don't think she's scared. Rather, I think she's very wise. And I think if we were to describe Esther in this moment, and maybe just as a person to this point, we would define Esther as a woman of courage, a person of courage. Esther is displaying courage in these verses as she approaches the king, knowing it could cost her her life. She's even showing hospitality to the villain who wants to annihilate her and her people, including a special passion to kill Mordecai, her uncle. When you think about courage in these moments, I'll read what one of these commentaries said that I read. It is fairly certain that little of importance is accomplished in the Bible or in the world without courage. Courage sometimes doesn't get the proclamation it needs to, right? It's not a fruit of the Spirit. It's not one of those words. But the word courage appears 30 times where it's an exhortation to take courage, to have courage, okay? And then there's 65 other times where it says to fear not. And that's also the opposite. It displays courage. If you're not fearing, then you're being courageous. And so I think there's great wisdom here that's happening in Esther's courage. I think courage gets the short riff sometimes because we think, well, you can't have courage and humility, like they're opposites. But that's not the case. Humility doesn't exclude having courage. Humility is a horse under control. It's a very powerful horse, but with its reins and its character, it's restrained, and so it knows how to function properly. Courage, humility. You think about where the situation that Esther is in and what she is doing. How does she get to this point where she has the courage to do so? I think it's important for us to look at these things that take place for our own benefits in life. When we face a situation where maybe we're not sure what we're supposed to do. 2 things to look at. If you go back to chapter 4, verse 15, we see Esther's heart. She says here, then Esther sent a reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will do as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. You see, in her great courage, it's beginning and it's birthed by a God dependency. Esther knows she can't approach the king without his blessing, and ultimately it's going to happen because of God's blessing. So she starts there. She acknowledges that in life. I cannot do this without God's help. And she goes into 3 days of fasting and asks others to do the same on her behalf. And so she starts out with this God dependency. The second thing is she has faithful action. All right? When you get to chapter 5, when we get to verse 1, we see her actually going. like she said she would. She puts on her royal robes and she goes and stands in front of the court of the palace. And characterize this by taking on her human responsibility. So two things that come in. You've got bold humility in that she is God-dependent. Then you have faithful action taking place because of her human responsibility. She's not sitting back. She could have. She could look, just like Mordecai. It'll come, salvation for the Jewish people will come from somebody else. It doesn't have to come from me. But she didn't. She was a woman of courage. She had bold humility with her God-dependence and faithful action with her human responsibility. So she's an example to us in that way. Now, when we go from chapter 5, we see the courageous Esther, and then we continue on here in verse 9. We're going to see the prideful Haman. Okay, look at verse 9 and following. Prideful Haman here. Verse 9, Haman went out that day happy and high in spirits. But when he saw, I might be on the wrong page. I'm on it? Thanks, Chuck. When he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Now, this isn't what we expect to be reading about Haman again. We want to know what's going on with Queen Esther, right, and the Jewish people. But this is very strategic to what God is doing. Seems like a rabbit trail at the time, but in hindsight, being 2020, we realize that. But look at Haman's pride here. In verses 11 and 12, look at what he's boasting about. He's boasting about wealth. He's boasting about his sons, the honor that he's been given, the power that he has, the reputation he has with the queen. Now, it's easy for us to see that for twofold. One, it's written down for us. But it's also easier, I think, to see pride in others, right? Let's say it this way. Pride makes it easier to see pride in others before you see pride in yourself. So if we would acknowledge it's easier to see pride in others before we see it in ourselves, that in itself is a boast. Pride. Pride makes it easier to see pride in others before you see pride in yourself. So, what about you? Do you boast about these things? He mentioned wealth. He mentioned his sons, the honor he has, the power he has, the reputation he has. I say, well, some of those things are good things. Interesting, I was talking to a person that I respect greatly, and he was reminding me of how good things can quickly become idols. Very good things in life. And he was kind of giving me a warning to beware about those things. Good things that become idols. So are we boasting about those things, or are we boasting in the cross alone? What we see here in Haman's pride is actually that everything is going well when he comes out of the banquet, right? Everything's going well until Haman's eyes saw one person. It says in verse 9, Haman went out happy and in high spirits. Everything's good. He's got lots of boasts. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, it goes on and says, he was filled with rage. Everything is cruising along. Everything is going great for Haman, but one person is under his skin. He can't take it any longer, and he's filled with rage. His appetite for all that he said before, wealth, sons, honor, power, and reputation, isn't enough. His eyes see one more thing that he wants. He wants Mordecai, and apparently he wants him on a pole. Proverbs 27:20 says this. It's a wise saying. Death and destruction are never satisfied, and neither are human eyes. Haman wasn't satisfied with wealth. He wasn't satisfied with his sons. He wasn't satisfied with honor or power or reputation. No, it's not enough for him. He has to have the approval or now removal of Mordecai. One person getting under Mordecai's skin. I understand Mordecai is the villain. Right? He's throwing it all away so he can get the approval or the annihilation of one man. Foolishness. Haman's pride sets the stage for his humiliation. We would say this is pride before a fall here. And so when we step into chapter 6, what we're wondering is about this pole that Mordecai had set up. Is that where Mordecai is going to end up? We were first wondering if Esther is going to survive, going into chapter 5. Now we're wondering, is Mordecai going to survive, going into chapter 6? Chapter 6, verse 1. Read it along with me here. That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition was Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court from the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man that the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse, and he rode Mordecai, and he led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zareth, his wife, and all his friends, everything that happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zareth said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So you want to know if Mordecai was going to survive. And what we have here is what's taking place with the villain's pride. There's a reversal that begins to happen here. You see, when you get to verse 6, we read that when Haman entered the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And Haman thought to himself, look at the pride in this. Thinks to himself, well, it's got to be me. It's got to be me that deserves that exaltation. I'm the one. And so now he's going to liven this up, all these things that should be done for the one the king wants to honor. And after all, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? And that pride is very quickly turned to grief by verse 12. Look at the way he leaves in verse 12. After this event, he's gone into the king's court to have Mordecai impaled on a pole, and this is the way he's leaving now. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. Can you see it? Can you see it in your mind? Haman, king, you gotta get him a robe. One of your robes out of your closet. People will actually think it's you because it's your clothing. And one of your horses, right? I got to drive in your car, okay? One of your wheels. Make sure it has a big crest on it so everybody can see it. It's your horse, okay? And then announce to everyone, this is what's done for the one the king wants to honor. Have somebody chanting that as going through all the streets of the city. Haman's coming up with this wonderful plan. He's coming up with his own plan for himself. That's what he's doing in his mind. What do I want the king to do for me? Right? I deserve this. This is mine. And then he hears the words, do this for Mordecai? And just not do this for Mordecai, but me? I'm going to do this for Mordecai? Well, he's having to swallow a lot of pride right here. It's interesting to think about what's happening here as we watch him go from being great to being little. Chapter 6 serves a really important point. You want to write this in or make a line or something, but this is where the entire story begins to pivot. Okay? Everything begins to change from this point. I want to ask you the question, how? How does that pivot happen? How do things all of a sudden change? I mean, things aren't looking good. It looks like, okay, things are going to really fail here. Mordecai is going to end up impaled on a pole. It begins to pivot. The whole story begins to pivot from this point forward. So was it all coincidence that these things took place, or was it providence? Coincidence or providence? Here's what a commentator says. The author of Esther uses coincidence to develop the plot and to delight the reader. Some of you are catching that delight of the author here. From a Christian perspective, however, we see that these happenstances as a sign of God's providence. While from a human perspective, life is full of accidents, from a biblical perspective, life is full of events that reflect God's sovereign plan. So when you get to verse 1, you see the king can't sleep. The king can't sleep. What does the king decide to do? Not a warm glass of milk, not count 100 sheep, right? Get out the book of Chronicles. Anybody, doing that these days? Get out my diary. Tell me what's happened. That's what he chose. Of all the things he could have done, he chooses the book of Annuals to be read to him. And then think about the person that's reading this. He's not reading it himself. There's a person reading it to him. And he ends up reading the account where Mordecai saves the king's life. That doesn't have to happen either. And yet it does. And if that ain't enough, the king who's trying to sleep, his heart is moved to honor Mordecai. That's something the king should have done a while back, but he didn't. He should have, but he neglected it. And now his heart is moved. Indeed, God has moved his heart. And so we begin to wonder, was it coincidence or was it providence? And who is the one that's pivoting this story? It's God. He's providentially pivoting the situation here. And all this taking place at night. Nighttime, right? There's a certain part of life where to sleep is to trust God. To trust him that he keeps working when you sleep. Right? And that's where you find true rest when things are not right in your worlds. Believing God works while you sleep. Indeed, that's the God that we have. I appreciate knowing that God works even when our world sleeps. Providence is always easy to realize after the fact, but if we believe God works providentially, then it should change us even in these moments. There's been someone in my life in this church, an older man, that I see this take place with him. For me, as a younger man, I feel like I don't see God's providence until long afterwards. And I wonder what life would be like if I truly believed God's providentially working to seize that in the very moment that things are taking place. And this older man that I talked to, he grasped that concept. And even when something does not go well in life, he seems very quick to acknowledge that God's hand is in it. It changes the way he walks through the situation. I hope we can learn those things quicker and earlier in life and instill it into our children. This concept that it's not a coincidence that God is working out his providence, that even when things are not going necessarily well in life, that in those moments we'd be able to acknowledge it. Then it would change the way we walk. When we leave chapter 6 with Haman being hurried to Esther's banquet, there's intent there with the author to hurry him along. Things are speeding out of control for Haman, and so we need to find out what happens when he goes to this banquet in chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life, for this is my petition. And spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary, the enemy, this vile Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out to the palace garden. But Haman realized the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king was slain. Will he even molest the queen as she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." And the king said, "Impale him on it." And so they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Esther's found favor with the king, and so, of course, it appeases the king to spare her life. And when the king hears the perpetrator is Haman, the king storms out of the banquet in a rage. Haman makes it even worse. You may not necessarily think anything of this, but only eunuchs are allowed to be with the king's women if the king's not present. Okay? So, Haman should have left when the king left, but he didn't. And he certainly shouldn't have been found close to the couch where the queen is reclining. A little wisdom there, right? And how about Harbona here? Why does he know about this pole? Well, this pole is about 75 feet tall. Why is the pole 75 feet tall? I mean, that seems ridiculous, doesn't it? 75 feet tall, and we're not talking about this is a land full of New York City skyscrapers. I mean, Haman in his pride made this pole so tall so everybody could see his enemy Mordecai impale on it. So everybody knows about this pole. How can you miss it? It's 75 feet tall. That's how Harbona knows about this pole. And so justice takes place, and the chapter closes with the king's fury subsided. How's yours? Presented Haman to you as the villain. You get wrapped up in the story, what's taking place. There's a part of you that is infuriated with the king. So how do you feel about Haman's fate? You might be sitting here thinking, well, he got what he deserved, but I am in church, so maybe I shouldn't feel that way. Well, you're right. Haman did get what he deserved. Okay, we could only pardon him if we could pardon Hitler. He's attempting the same thing. And you're right, we are in a church building, but you need to know that what you feel is okay, that justice has been served. Talked a little bit about this in Sunday school this morning. We have to realize that God is a just God, that indeed he gives government swords for a reason. When we read Esther, we can relate with what David says when he says this in Psalm 7, verse 14. Whoever is pregnant with evil conceives trouble and gives birth to delusionment. Whoever digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit they have made. The trouble they cause recoils on them. Their violence comes down on their own heads. And so what happens is when you get to this spot in the book of Esther is a very normal response, which actually causes us to do the same thing that David did in the following verse of that psalm. And I will give thanks to the Lord because of his righteousness. He is a just God. And I will sing the praises of the name of the Lord Most High. God is a just God. So the villain is off the scene at this point. But you do have to recognize we still do not know about the Jewish nation, whether they will survive, because the law that was written still stands. It can't simply be redacted. Something has to be done with that, but that will come later. We've looked at a few observations that we've traveled through these chapters. In chapter 5, we got to see courage versus pride. We got to see in chapter 6 coincidence or providence, and then here in chapter 7 just now, justice taking place. But to bring us to the full picture that I want to show you, I need to read 2 more verses. Chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. It takes place on the same day. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. My main point that you'll see there that relates back to the story I began with is that only God's exaltation is worth seeking. Only God's exaltation is worth seeking. You can seek man's exaltation. You can. It will last for a short time because this life is only a vapor and normally people are not that nice. You can seek your own exaltation, but it ends up being pride in the worst way. That's what we see with Haman. He exalts himself. Or you can humble yourself and let God exalt you. Jesus says this. He says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. There's a few times he says it. I want to show you it in Luke 18. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Luke chapter 18. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to a temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up into heaven. He beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now Jesus, he's talking to a specific group of people who are taking pride in their own righteousness within the law. They didn't think they needed God's help. And they also look down on everyone else. They're preferring the self-exaltation. But Jesus says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What takes place there when Jesus talks about this? Those who exalt themselves are going to be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted, is a role reversal. Right? The exalted end up being humbled, and the humbled end up being exalted. That's exactly what we see taking place in Esther 5 through 7. Reversal. God's a master at this. That's why I've labeled it God's reversal. Haman's self-exaltation reverses to humiliation, and Mordecai's humility reverses to exaltation. Haman sets a pole in pride in chapter 5, and he's humbled by it in chapter 7. In chapter 6, Haman plans his own self-exaltation at the king's expense, and by the end of it, he's humbled to find out the plan is for Mordecai. Mordecai, however, should have been exalted in chapter 2, remains in humility until the king exalts him in chapter 8. You see, in chapter 2, Mordecai saves the king, and it appears as if Haman gets Mordecai's reward in chapter 3. Then we see the king give his signet ring to Haman in chapter 3, verse 10. That's not the way the story was supposed to go. It's not the way we'd expect to read the story. But then what takes place in chapter 8 that I read to you, verse 2, Mordecai gets the signet ring. God has reversed the positions where Haman exalted himself, and Mordecai was to end up on a pole. Haman ends up on the pole. And where Mordecai was humble, he ends up having the signet ring in the end, where Haman was, in charge of indeed of his whole household there. Roles reversed. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. As I began reading these chapters this week, just thinking through things. One of the things I saw, I didn't mention it this way, but God, I believe, is the reason why Mordecai wasn't rewarded right when he should have been back in chapter 2. I think God actually delays exalting Mordecai for his perfect timing, and in doing so, really a greater glory. It's kind of like with Joseph, saving of a whole people. And so the reward is delayed. God waits to exalt Mordecai until his perfect time and for a greater glory. So I ask you this, have you ever felt overlooked? You ever felt unnoticed? Overlooked, unnoticed. I take encouragement from here. Because if you think you're being overlooked and you think you're going unnoticed, you're actually wrong, because God knows. God knows, and he's going to reward you in his perfect timing. His perfect timing for his greater glory. His greater glory. Even better. Secondly, it was a reminder to choose humility and not the pride of self-exaltation. Right? We read through these, we see what happens to Haman, the villain. There's even things where it's like, why did you get counsel from who you got counsel from? Their bias, right? Why would you let one person get under your skin? Do you lose it all? There's a little bit of a heart of compassion there for even the villain. What we see is Haman's pride just destroys him. And so there's a reminder here not to have pride and self-exhortation. Rather, there's a parable where it talks about to be faithful, those who are faithful with little will be given, entrusted much, right? To be faithful with what God has given us and to let him decide when to entrust us with more. Our world we grew up in, it's just charge it, get it now, right? In premarital counseling, one of the things we talk about is not going into debt right off the bat, right? You don't have to have all the furnishings in the house right immediately, okay? But we have that kind of perspective. We want it all now rather than waiting on God to supply it, to entrust it to us. It's also this principle that another person in ministry mentions to me often. He says, bloom where you are planted. Bloom where you are planted. Be focused where you are now. The grass isn't greener on the other side all the time. Bloom where you're planted. Do what God has entrusted you now. Take full responsibility for it. Blossom there. And let God take care of the rest. He'll exalt you in due time. And thirdly, when you think about it, we see Haman boasting about these things, and some of these things we would say are good things. And he talks about his sons. That implies a lot of things. But we're going to look at that and we're going to say, well, sons are a good thing. We can do that. But really, at that point, if we become boasters that way, then it's idolatry. We only have one thing to boast in, and that's the cross. And that's where we keep things in proper perspective. It also takes out that root where you saw those trying to obtain their own righteousness, that they scorned others, they placed themselves above other people. That doesn't take place. If we realize and we humble ourselves at the point of a cross, it washes all those barriers out. The third thing that I see is the great reversal of salvation. The great reversal of salvation. This is a reversal that has taken place for Christians, okay? From sinner to saint, from death to life, from old to new, from enemy of God to child of God. I'm going to read for you Colossians 2, verse 13. When you were dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The devil sets the cross up to kill Christ. Haman sets up the pole to kill Mordecai. And what did the cross do? It set us free, right? Role reversal taking place for us, from sinner to saint. There has been a great reversal in the Christian life. And think about where that began for you. Or if you haven't come to Christ, where it begins is to humble yourself. To humble yourself. Philippians talks about have this mind of Christ. It's about humility. And that's the way you begin a relationship with God. You humble yourself to where you will say, I need forgiveness. It takes humility. Jesus said, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Indeed, we should only be concerned about God exalting us. It's the only one of worth. And we see God's great reversal take place. Small book of Esther, tremendous implications for us. We see God working. Not by name, but by what he's actively doing in the lives of people.